Accessing library computer data.
Out there are no saints. Just people.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. We're continuing our run through of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. We're up to the episode called The Die Is Cast. It is the 21st episode of the third season. May 1st, 1995 was the air date. Written by Ronald D. Moore, directed by David Livingston. In this episode, the Cardassian-Romulan fleet enters the Gamma Quadrant. Sisko goes against Starfleet orders to rescue Odo. We're joined by Clay. Clay, how are you?
Good. This reminds me of that time that I had a burrito in the fridge, and I was going to eat it, and I took a step back and I said, no, let's just see what the burrito does first.
This is now the 8th episode in a row that the burrito has made its appearance into the podcast. Darren, how are you?
And it's tougher every time I encounter it.
I'm good. This reminds me of the occasion that I didn't have a burrito, but somebody else had a burrito, and then somebody mugged them, took the burrito, and I had to watch them do it in slow motion, despite the fact that I had nothing to do with the situation at all.
Serious, ignorant American question. Are there burritos in Ireland?
There are indeed. They're very, very hipster over here. They're like donut shops.
Interesting.
Yeah, you can tell it's like one of the things, like one of the markers, again, not to get too specific, but Ireland went through a bit of a recession like everybody else around about 2008, but it was particularly severe. And you could tell that things were sort of coming back in the city because all of a sudden you had like 5 donut shops and 2 burrito bars within every square kilometer. Like I literally cannot walk from my office to the bus stop to get home without passing 2 burrito bars and like 4 donut shops. It's quite
the nightmare of the Conservative Party over here. A burrito stand on every corner.
And like
sounds like heaven to me.
After walking past all of these donut shops, Darren is similar to an Aberntane in that he's lost his form-fitting suit or whatever, and is now just rotundly rolling down the hill.
I mean,
but I've retained my fashion sense. Thank you very much.
You don't really need to sell me on Ireland more than like, everywhere I walk, it's just donut shops and burrito stands.
I heard you clicking on kayak.com over there, Clay, in the background, booking your next trip over. Anyway, let's talk about the Die Is Cast. We're going to take a break. I'm going to play an audio clip. Me, Darren, and Clay are going to come back and we're going to break down the conclusion to this tame 2-parter, the Die Is Cast.
What's the matter, Garak? You don't look very happy. Aren't you enjoying yourself?
There is no pleasure in this for me, Constable, I assure you. I am simply doing my job.
Your job? Yes. It's the job you've been waiting for. All these years of exile. And here you are, interrogating a prisoner again. It must fill you with pride.
Odo, just tell me what I need to know, and this will end.
All right, so I left us off with our ratings for Improbable Cause, which I gave a 5 by saying that I'll clarify what I meant here going forward. Clay, we've talked, or why I think the ratings are funny for this series in particular, as opposed to something like TNG. Mm-hmm. Clay, we've talked before in trying to, is there something about human perspective where if an episode is epic enough, people think it's great? And if something is very large in a very big story, do people just kind of have a predilection to saying that was a great episode? It happens a lot on TNG, and I don't know if it's just the great episodes seem more epic, or if it's an epic idea lends itself to being perceived as great. But I like the Die Is Cast. I don't think the Die Is Cast is as strong a single episode as Improbable Cause is, because there's a few things about the Die Is Cast that I don't think the series does what this episode is trying to do as well as it will in the future, and this is like a baby step for it. And where Improbable Cause was a pure character study that the show can do at this point, as long as the idea is strong, they can ace that world. These kind of action space opera epics are a little bit out of the show's wheelhouse at this point, and I think that the Die Is Cast has a few flaws in it, even though I really love the episode.
Yeah, the last episode I mentioned that it seemed like this was kind of an inversion of the way that they usually handle these 2-parters, and I think one of the things that supports that idea for me is that this feels very much like, even though it's the second half, it feels very much like a setup episode. In that it has, it has the big space opera stuff, which is very much feels like a climax, but the stuff that's actually happening is really setting up stuff that's going to come after it. And so it's fascinating to me how if you were to flip them, it would feel more like the way they usually do it, where, it's kind of splashy at the front, set up a bunch of stuff, and then the second one is a little bit smaller, and it's a little bit more usually character-driven, or it's them figuring out how to get out of the writing problem they put themselves in with the first half.
Yeah. Which never feels as satisfying. This is different because this feels like a satisfying escalation of improbable cause, as opposed to fixing the solution, as opposed to the problem with Best of Both Worlds 2, which is that it's like, this kind of feels like a little bit of a letdown.
Yeah, and I think it's the reason that one of the reasons it feels so satisfying is because they're not really trying to figure out how to wrap it up. They're just kind of telling the story. The wrap up, the part that they are wrapping up is a continuation from the first half, in that they have to get Odo back, and Garak has a bunch of character stuff that they have to kind of work out with him and Tane and all that kind of stuff. They do wrap that stuff up, but they are not wrapping up the external action at all. If anything, like I said, it's a setup for what's going to come later. And I think that's really important in making these feel different from the way they usually do it, because they always end up the second half, you got to wrap everything up. It always feels unsatisfying because they got to figure some way to get Picard back on the ship from being a Borg or whatever, and you always kind of go, I don't really know about that. And I think it's a symptom of having to try and do everything at once, whereas these episodes allow them to focus in on very specific things and just let the other stuff play out. And even here, like I said, they're wrapping very specific things up, but the other stuff is just playing out. And I find that so much more satisfying than if they had to like if this was TNG, this would have ended with the Federation bombing in at the end and like blowing up all of the Jem'Hadar, and that would just be it. Right. And it would just feel really like tacked on and like, well, they didn't really earn that, but they have to do that because next week we can't be dealing with the fallout of what happened in this episode. But since Deep Space Nine allows for that, it allows much smaller resolutions inside of a larger story, which is very fun. And what's interesting about it too is that I actually don't really like the stuff. I think the Odo, not the Odo stuff. The Odo stuff is good. I think much like they still have problems in this episode that they've had in previous episodes that I've watched. Mainly, there is a B plot that involves people just on a ship going from point A to point B, and it's really not very satisfying. Because I was watching this episode thinking like, man, I'm really into this, but this whole everybody get on the Defiant and go find Odo thing feels really, frankly, unbelievable to me, because the Admiral just told them, the Cardassians and the Romulans are going to attack the Jem'Hadar. We don't know what's going to happen. We need you to get everybody who is non-essential off of Deep Space Nine and just be prepared for a possible giant fight. And Sisko's like, no, I think I'm going to take everyone who's important to this station with me, leave, and go get one guy who, in the grand scheme of things, not really important to everything that the Admiral just told me. But that stuff was kind of unbelievable to me. But everything else I thought was great.
Have you seen San Andreas, which has a very similar plot point where The Rock is a rescue worker working in California during the biggest earthquake on record, but decides to take his search and rescue helicopter to go and get his daughter in the middle of this gigantic crisis?
Right. Yeah.
You're asking us if we haven't seen San Andreas. This is a required viewing for Americans. No, I have not actually seen that, although it sounds probably remarkably similar to what would happen in the movie Rampage starring The Rock, I would imagine.
Now, I feel like that would be a one-to-one comparison if, at the beginning of San Andreas, The Rock's supervisor was like, hey, you're a rescue worker. we need you to go and stay by this building that's full of people and get everybody out of this building because the building might collapse and kill everybody around them. And he's like, okay, no, I'm just kidding. I'm just going to go fuck off.
I'm going to get a burrito.
My daughter. Yeah. I hear Ireland is full of donuts and burritos. Let's go there.
So, Darren, before we continue on, did you want to talk to the what are your thoughts about the epic thing? And then if you want to dovetail that into Clay's point about the Federation storyline here, because I think that's a good place to start.
Well, I mean, the epic thing is kind of interesting because, like, you're entirely correct that I think there's a tendency in fandom in general, and not just Star Trek fandom, but like all sorts of like television fandom, like long form storytelling fandom, to sort of fixate on the big events. And I mean, like, you see that in comic books where like the things that sell are the big event comics where nothing will ever be the same again, and to sort of assume that they exude a narrative gravity that makes them immediately worthy of like discussion and attention and all this sort of stuff. And I think that there's an aspect of that to this two-parter, but one of the things, and again, this ties into like what I've been talking about, like the difference inheritance that like Deep Space Nine took from the Next Generation as opposed to the other Star Trek shows, which is that like Deep Space Nine does these wonderful, epic, like galactic stories, and in many ways, like Deep Space Nine is the story of like this Alpha Quadrant that gets tied up in this sort of like epic saga that like involves all the great powers and has these gigantic stakes eventually, and everything sort of like keeps escalating and escalating throughout. But what Deep Space Nine does that's very interesting is that it always anchors that in the deeply personal, in that it's always something personal that instigates all this like epic drama and these massive betrayals and these huge battles, for example. Like, for example, in this one, like, Garak and Odo end up on a Romulan ship invading Dominion space, trying to commit mass genocide because, you know, Garak was almost murdered when his shop was blown up. And it's like, that's your sort of segue into talking about that. But later on, you have all the stuff with the Klingons, which involves Worf, for example. You have another huge crisis that begins because one of the guest stars like has this like big insecurity about his social status, and so decides to trade up by betraying his entire people. I'm being very vague here because Clay hasn't seen the series, but anybody who has knows what I'm talking about. And like Deep Space Nine always
that's the one where Sisko shoots Jake, right?
Yeah, and it's revealed that Jake was actually Garak all along.
Yep. Okay.
But yeah, it's like it happens sort of repeatedly over the course of the show. Deep Space Nine always grounds these like huge epic moments in something very, very small. And even in the Dias cast, like the centerpiece of the episode is obviously the big like explosion, boom, stuff blow up. Dennis McCarthy finally gets to do an operatic score sort of bit at the climax, but it also hinges on that small scene between Garak and Odo, which is very personal and very intimate. And Deep Space Nine then after this obviously goes on. The next episode is really small and really intimate. It's almost a chamber piece. And it sort of does that throughout. Like, so after The Way of the Warrior, it does like The Visitor, which is another small intimate chamber piece. And this is in contrast to, say, what Voyager learned from Next Generation, which is always like bigger is better. And Voyager has this weird fixation on doing like blockbuster storytelling on television, where it's big event after big event after big event after big event, but with no character work tied into it. So like you have, I recently rewatched like the 6th season cliffhanger of Voyager, which is basically, what if the best of both worlds, but 3 times as large, because that means it's 3 times as better. And you're like, no, that's not how storytelling works. And I think that like Deep Space Nine, in particular, like the Dias cast and Probable Cause, work as well as they do because they never lose sight of the characters. And I think that we talked last week about like one of the interesting things about this two-parter, and Wes pointed it out, is that basically what this two-parter does is it forces the Federation to take a back seat. And it basically says, look, the most important thing that's happening in these 2 episodes does not involve the Federation in any way, shape, or form. I think that Clay pointed out last week that Starfleet's position is basically like, we'll sit back and see what happens, really, when the dust settles. So you have this interesting thing where, like, the big late season two-parter involves the Romulans, who have not been an active part of Deep Space Nine, for, particularly active part of it, and the Cardassians, who have, always been sort of eager, but have never really had, like, a big focal sort of, like, Klingon Civil War type thing going on, and the Dominion, which are an ominous threat that were really introduced at the start of the season. And these are the 3 actors who are sort of, like, dancing around each other at a knife fight over the course of the episode. And Deep Space Nine is basically like, well, what if we watch the interactions of these 3 forces at play, and we assume that each of them have their own separate agendas for what's taking place, and like none of this directly affects the Federation. It's one of those great, not everything is about you, Picard moments, like from Star Trek. It's like, okay, the Cardassians do have a life outside of just being painful and sort of like oppressing like people in the demilitarized zone. I think Clay's entirely right that like one of the weakest spots of the episode is the fact that it absolutely 110% has to justify having like the other 7 members of the main cast involved in any way, shape, or form. Because it has to come up with something for them to do. And there's a really great moment in the episode where this really, really, really shines through, which is when, after they've hijacked the Defiant, after they've gone into the Gamma Quadrant, after they're chasing Odo, you have this scene where like the cloak is failing, and you have this, oh my god, everything's like gone to hell and we're decloaked. And you have like the act break, which consists of Kira saying, Commander, if the Jem'Hadar show up while we're decloaked, Sisko says, we'll have to fight our way out of here. As the camera zooms in on his face and the music soars in the background. And it's like, you can tell the writers were like, we really have to remind the audience that like Sisko is technically the lead of this show. So, let's do something that explains why he's not doing anything in this episode.
I nearly fell out of my chair with it. There was like the opposite reaction of falling out of a chair. I couldn't believe how bad that line in the push zoom in on was. He's like, we'll fight our way out. It's like a video game sequence or something. It was terrible.
I also loved how manufactured all of that tension was when when the cloak fails and the guy's like, yeah, no, that was me. I did that because I was under orders to do it. But now that I've done it, technically I've fulfilled my mission. So yeah, you can totally trust me again. Yeah. And then it's like, good.
Well, Clay,
now the cloak is fixed. It's like nothing has happened.
I don't know if you remember.
I'll just call you landfill for the rest of the time.
We'll never speak of it again.
Yeah.
Michael Eddington was introduced in The Search. And we have not...
He did look familiar, but I couldn't place where
he apparently has been working as like a co-chief of security with Odo. We've just never seen him since The Search. But he is that character. And that scene would have worked so much better if he had just been in one other episode. It's like, instead of just random dude who's here and gonna blow up the cloak.
You don't mean just hanging the camera 6 inches from his face five or six times in the episode wasn't good enough for you?
Yeah, and he's distractingly balding in a way that a lot of actors aren't anymore. So it's like, it's the only thing that I can really.
Yeah, he's got like cartoon comic book balding hair.
Homer Simpson. Yeah, he becomes a very important character actually, and it's just kind of a letdown the way that they do it here. And totally, I agree with you that his whole thing. Sisko gets to do his sort of dramatic, like, anyone who wears that uniform, I never doubt their word. He gets to do that sort of thing. But
that was kind of a good line. I like that line.
The other
what's
scene,
interesting about that? Oh, sorry.
Well, just the other scene that's weird is there's a Kira and Sisko scene where Kira wants to check on O'Brien and Sisko's like, leave him alone. That scene has no relevance to anything. It's just in there. It's weird.
Right.
Just on that, like, Sisko and Eddington line, that's a really great example of, like, you could almost feel the Deep Space Nine writers figuring something out as they're writing it. It's like, we'll throw it in because we need to, like, save time, and we need to justify having all these sets and all these actors who we're paying to hang around for the week that we're shooting this episode with the Cardassians and the Romulans. But you have, like, that line where, like, Sisko and Eddington talk about how much the uniform means to them.
Yeah.
And that sort of like sets up something later on with the characters that I don't think the writers had figured out at this point in the show, but which becomes like an interesting dynamic back and forth between the two. And it's weird that it's seated in such a completely throwaway, pointless sort of subplot. Because this is very much like, this reminds me of like, later on as the show grows and it sort of expands its focus, it always has this limitation of like 90s television. Because now if you were doing this episode on a show like, say, Westworld or Sopranos or Game of Thrones, what you would simply do is you would do this episode and Sisko wouldn't be in it at all. You'd have, like, you'd come up with some excuse at the end for Garak and Odo to get back to the station. Maybe the Dominion sort of let them go because he's a changeling or whatever. But, like, you wouldn't need to have this subplot that keeps coming back to, like, oh, O'Brien, Kira, Bashir, Sisko, and Dax are also in the show. But because this is 90s television and because they have to be in almost every episode, you really have this really awkward sort of sutured in subplot that really messes with the tempo of the story. And it happens again over the course of the show. Like later on in the 6th season, there's an episode where O'Brien gets a character-centric episode, but they literally have to write a scene into the start of the episode, Honor Among Thieves, where all the characters are like, oh man, I am so concerned about O'Brien while he's doing this thing that none of us are involved in. Isn't it great that we're all standing around talking about that together?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's a subplot that I totally understand why it's there though. Like I can see the struggle in the episode that they must have had where it's like Odo and Garak are in the was it the Gamma Quadrant?
Yep.
Yeah. So Odo and Garak are in the Gamma Quadrant. We've set up this thing that Starfleet is telling Sisko that they could be on the brink of war. You need to get everybody out of Deep Space Nine. And if they had just left that, those are two fairly interesting stories. Like what Cisco and company do on Deep Space Nine to prepare for this could be fairly interesting. Dealing with people and telling them how they're gonna, seeing how people are gonna react to this news and
separating
how are they gonna get everybody off.
Blah blah blah.
Yeah. It's very much a separate story from what's happening with Garak and Odo. But the problem is, you need to get Odo and Garak back. And the only thing that they have, lest they somehow steal a Romulan warbird and fly that away, all they've got is a runabout. And you've set... I wouldn't put it past them in another season to maybe do that. But all they've got on the ship is a runabout. And you've already set the Jem'Hadar up as being able to blow up the fucking Enterprise. So they're not going to be able to make it out of there alive if all they have is a runabout. So they're going to need someone, maybe with a smaller ship that can move fast, that has lots of guns on it, to save them. So you got to get Cisco onto the Defiant so he can go, because they need to get Odo and Garak back. So I understand the conundrum there. I just wish they had managed to do it a little bit more seamlessly.
Well,
but
I don't think, I think they spend too much time with it. And the problem...
I would agree.
To me,
they treat it like a...
Yeah, they treat it like a subplot that actually needs to be there, as opposed to seeing us get on the Defiant and then showing up at the end. Like, I don't need to see this middle journey.
Exactly.
But the thing is that the other thing that focusing on that does is that I think it does damage to the actual Odo and Garak storyline, which I feel is missing a scene between the two of them. There should be a early torture scene between Garak and Odo, instead of the Garak turns the machine on and we get the Kira scene saying she wants to talk to O'Brien, and then we cut back to Odo suffering from the torture effect.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little bit there where, because the pacing of that storyline is so fast, the character flipping and the character interactions between Odo and Garak feel forced. It feels like they're not naturally arriving at positions that they should be. I think you can overlook it. It's just something I think would be strengthened by one more scene between the two of them, where Odo needles Garak a little bit about how he's not as good at his job as he used to be.
Yeah, and I also thought that their interactions were... I was surprised that Garak had apparently straight up flipped sides. Like, the nature of his character is such that I kept expecting, especially that early scene where he comes in and he's kind of basically telling Odo what's going to happen, and Odo's being, bristling up against it, and Garak ends the scene by saying, "I really hope you'll listen to what I say." And I was like, oh, that's going to be one of those things where, a Sherlock Holmes kind of thing, where Odo's like, "I realized what you were telling me was actually this." One of those things to, like, that's how they managed to get out, because Garak never really switched sides all along. He was giving him kind of like this coded message kind of thing, one of those things. Yep. But that's not the case. He's just back with Cardassia now.
Yes, which is true to his character. That's all he's ever said that he wanted to do. But I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's presented as that character who is always going to walk the line, but always end up, as I've talked about before, always end up on the side of the good guys. And I guess having him flip is not a bad thing. I don't think they did anything wrong. But I think what's missing might be a scene where he is conflicted a little bit about it or something. I don't know. I feel like there's
that's kind of my torture scene idea, is to heighten the fact that Odo's pushing back.
Yeah, I think there needs to be some indication that this decision is for real, or like, or something. I don't know. It just seems like such a flip switch for him to just go back to being a torturer, or just with Cardassia. Like, I kept expecting, like, when he brought that machine in, and he's talking about torturing him and all this kind of stuff. I thought that that was going to be the point where he, like, killed those two Romulans, and we're like, all right, we got to get out of here. Like, right. One of those things. I'm happy they didn't do that, because I think it's more interesting what they ended up doing. But I just kept waiting for that scene, and it never came.
Darren, what did you think?
Of the three of us, I seem to be the one who actually really, really liked the Odo and Garak sort of interactions, and I thought that it got at something.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I thought they were great. I really liked those scenes.
But I actually thought that a lot of it felt very in character and very well observed, and particularly in terms of how Deep Space Nine approaches its outsider or its non-Starfleet characters, and even its Starfleet characters when Worf eventually shows up in the fourth season. Because Deep Space Nine has this not weird, but it has this idea repeatedly, and it's a very, like, the stock criticism of Deep Space Nine is that it's not Star Trek because it's very dark, it's very ominous, and it's very cynical about the human condition. And even, like, we talked a little bit last week on Improbable Cause about how, like, Garak's opening conversation with Bashir, where he's like, oh, by the way, humans, you still, like, have that sort of appetite and that greed, and you still eat as if somebody's going to snatch it off your plate. So maybe, like, your brutal sort of impulses aren't that far from the surface, which is something that seems very un-Star Trekian when you sort of look at it at the premise of, like, Roddenberry's shared universe. But one of the things that Deep Space Nine has that's very humanist and that feels like its own, like, slant on what makes Star Trek is the idea that if people who are radically different from one another and come from completely different backgrounds and cultures and sort of different perspectives, if they come together and they spend time together, inevitably over time, the best values, and by the best values, the, like, democracy and human rights and self-respect and respect for other people and tolerance and empathy, will all come out and come to the fore, and they become sort of contagious. So you have this motif that runs through Deep Space Nine repeatedly, where characters come from different backgrounds, different cultures that are perhaps more adversarial, more aggressive, less rights-focused, less democratic than the Federation. So I'm thinking, for example, explicitly of Garak coming from Cardassia, but it also applies to Quark coming from Ferenginar, or Odo, who is, like, he's literally defined as a straight-up fascist. He's really, really into justice. And by justice, we mean oppression. And also, like, Worf, who comes from, like, the Klingon culture, which is very sort of rigid, old-fashioned, it's a literal empire. And what happens is the idea that by spending time with the Federation, by spending time in the company of these human characters, they are sort of changed by that experience to the point where they become fundamentally different people. And Odo's entirely correct when he tells Garak early on that, like, living on Deep Space Nine has made you rusty. And that Garak is not as good as he used to be at what he's doing. And a large part of why I think Garak's, like, heel-face turn is so dramatic in the first half of the episode and why he's so committed to it is because he wants to prove to both himself and to Tane that he is exactly as Cardassian as he was when he was exiled, that he is exactly as totalitarian, exactly as ruthless, and exactly as brutal. And he even has that conversation with Tane where he's like, look, I have to torture Odo because if I don't, you won't trust me. You won't take me back in. You won't accept that I'm the same person that came up with you or that came up under you. I have to actually do these things in order to prove to yourself and also to myself that I am still as ruthless and violent as I used to be. And the reality is that he's not. He's like Quark has sort of like been like internalized these values of the Federation, where Quark over the course of Deep Space Nine becomes this weird like humanist figure in a very strange sense, where he's got like almost, he's not a heart of gold, and he repeatedly pushes against it, but it comes up time and time again that he's not a Ferengi in the same way that other Ferengi are. Garak is not a Cardassian in the same way that he presents himself to be, and he's like over the course of the series, like in conversation, like he's introduced talking to, like he has conversation with Bashir about like the literary form. He complains about like, you know, he complains about Julius Caesar as a work of like human fiction. It's like, that's not how you write fiction. Cardassian fiction is so much better and more intricate and fantastic. And yet at the end of this episode, what does he quote but Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare? And there's a sense that like, as much as Garak wants to be Cardassian and ruthless and not to feel anything, and as much as his performance is geared towards that, in that it's a very showy performance, he's very peacocking for both Tane and for Odo and for himself to say, look, I'm still as ruthless and violent as I always was. There's a sense throughout that he's not. And even though he wants to go home, and this happens repeatedly over the course of the show, and it's like, it's literally how the die is cast in Improbable Cause parallel Odo and Garak, in that both of them are exiles who want to go home on some fundamental level. The only difference is that Odo knows for a fact that he can't go home, whereas Garak has to learn it in this two-parter that he can't go back to the way things used to be. Where you have that sort of like... Oh,
so,
go ahead.
Well, Odo has the And what I was talking about in Probable Cause is that Odo has the upper hand in these episodes in his battle because Odo has a realization of what the status quo is at this point, and that Odo recognizes that he can't go home because he doesn't fit in with the founders. And he has that line about me and you, Garak, have the same enemy, and it's Tane. You just don't recognize it yet. Odo recognizes in Garak that Garak doesn't see in himself that Garak is too changed to return home at this point. He does not fit in there, just the same way that Odo doesn't fit in there. So their stories dovetail again at the very end, where they both realize that, they have the conversation about, well, we can at least be friends together here as strangers in a strange land. And it's just built nicely off of that. I think that's the thing about the episode, is that Garak's reversal from being in total control is flipped in this episode, and I don't think he even recognizes it until he starts to torture Odo and then has misgivings about it.
I kind of, it would have been great if instead of quoting Julius Caesar at the end, he had made a callback to Hellraiser and just said Jesus wept.
I had something about I was going to say something about the culture influence, but I don't think I really have anything. Does anyone want to, while I collect my thoughts, does anyone have anything that they wanted to build off of that? If you want to keep talking about Garak and Odo's torture scene, or should we just get into more of the space? Let's save the space epic stuff and the overall meta plot for later.
But I mean, Garak and Odo are two sides of the same coin, and there's this weird, interesting thing that, and I think Deep Space Nine sort of builds off Next Generation when it inherits Worf, which is this idea that when you are an exile from your people, when you feel sort of distant from them or isolated from them, you tend to, your nationalism becomes almost performative, in that, like, Worf, and it happens repeatedly over, say, the Next Generation and into Deep Space Nine, where Worf is like this idealized Klingon form. Like, he's the most honorable of Klingons.
We say that Worf learned to be a Klingon by reading about them, is how we describe it.
Worf is basically a hipster Klingon.
Yep.
That's it, exactly. And Garak at this point is almost a hipster Cardassian, in that he's sort of like, he understands what he has to do to be a Cardassian, but he just doesn't recognize the culture when he comes back to it. And there's this nice tension that runs through his arc over the course of the entire series, where Garak accepts that the Cardassia that he left is never going to be the one that he can come back to. And it becomes this sort of really, like, poignant sort of running plot. But the Dias cast really encapsulates that very, very well, which is like, Garak can't do what he used to do because he spent so much time with probably Bashir, if we're being entirely honest.
They never say it, but it would make sense in Garak's character and how he grew up to be this super spy and everything. Garak probably has never really had real friends to this point, right? Like, the station would probably be the first people that he's actually connected with, because, as we've seen of the Obsidian Order, they are not above killing even their closest confidants regularly. So Garak's been exposed to this, by befriending Bashir and Odo to an extent, they respect each other.
And they kind of touch on that in the first episode, don't they? In that scene where they're eating together, or am I just remembering that wrong? But doesn't Garak have some line about, like, what do you think that we're doing here, or something?
That's a different episode,
maybe I'm just.
You might be.
That's the Wire, where he has this big shouting match with Bashir.
Yes, yeah.
Right. While they're having lunch. But yeah, I like that it's like Garak has probably never had a standing lunch date before, which feels like a waste. He's a very good conversationalist.
Yeah,
seems to know,
and he eats slowly.
He's well read.
I did like when they cut back to Bashir and O'Brien. O'Brien's like, "What the fuck are you talking about?"
I'm
trying to eat. Stop talking to me.
That's something that's been put on the back burner, is their friendship, sort of. Although it makes sense. Yeah, I do like that performance and everything.
I love that Deep Space Nine does things like that. Like, again, this is the, like, intimate and epic thing that Deep Space Nine does very well. Where, like, the scene where a bunch of, like, fuck off Romulan warbirds and Cardassian ships show up on the doorstep the sequence opens with, like, O'Brien and Bashir have breakfast. Stay tuned for more. And it works really well.
My thing about that is the show now just making fun of the fact that cloaked ships are not cloaked at all? Like, every episode they seem to be surprised. The way that cloak working seems to be that people have extremely short-term memory about cloaks existing, and because they're always like, well, we're sensing these anomalous readings out there. It looks like something invisible is out there, and then the ship decloaks, and they're like, "Oh shit, it was a cloaked ship." It's like, no shit, of course that's what it was. It's just very odd to me.
I like the idea that O'Brien has a post-it on his little panel underneath anomalous sensor readings going, "It's probably a cloaked ship."
Yes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's a unique setup too, where the station is not in Federation space, right? It's in Bajoran space, which is not part of the Federation. So you do get more. They are kind of out there on their own, and like when the fleet passes, you get the sense of they're not invading Federation territory. They're just passing through this other section. It gives you a nice grounding into how isolated the station is from Federation.
Yeah, it was the first time they've ever had a fleet reveal like that that wasn't just the beginning of an assault on the station or on the ship or something. It's just like, oh yeah, those guys are here and they're just taking the long way around, just passing through to get to the wormhole. Nothing to see here.
They're going to pass through. I think that Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just to touch back on the Odo and Garak stuff. I think I kept looking for that turn that I was talking about, where I kept expecting Garak to, be like, hey, I'm obviously on your side. This is how we're going to get out of here. And everything up in this episode, up until they cut back to the interrogation scene and Odo is like falling apart, I was kind of a little wishy-washy on it. And it was up until from that point on, I was like, oh shit, they're actually doing some stuff here. Like that cut back to him like falling apart and that Garak was actually torturing him was the point in the episode where I was really engaged. And from that point on, everything that they did after that, I thought was really, that's when it really showed me what they were trying to do, where they had the character stuff, but they were pushing these guys very hard in very different directions and setting up stuff that was coming later. When they start revealing the Romulan Cardassian alliance, but it's not really an alliance, and the Jem'Hadar. It turns out the Gem. It was a ruse the whole time. Like that stuff was like, man, I was not expecting that stuff. That was all of those twists and turns I thought were great. Great use of the he made me fuck her guy too. He was the main. He's the main Dorser. Yeah, the main Romulan guy who turns out to be the founder.
Yes, yeah. I like that too. Did the reveal catch you? But I was surprised on rewatch how much they hint that he is a changeling throughout the thing.
I didn't see it coming at all.
Okay, because he has the line about "You are a liar, Mr. Garak, and I am an observer," which is what the founders consider themselves to be. He is extremely concerned for Odo's safety throughout the entire thing. He never wants to have have Odo harmed.
He's also surprised to learn about like the whole changeling,
the torture device.
The torture device, which would be obviously more concerning to a changeling.
Yeah, that's some good intel he got there. Yeah, I have to say, I was very happy that after he revealed himself to be a changeling, he didn't turn back into Odo's mom or something. Like you never see what his changeling form is. They just transport him out of there. I was very happy that they didn't do something like Sappy there.
See, I think it's a missed opportunity not to have him change back into the generic changeling form, which is a imitation of them imitating Odo. Because we never actually.
By the way, really mean spirited. Like the entire race exists basically to mock Odo's inability to do a proper human face.
Yes,
it's really passive aggressive.
Well,
is that what it is?
Yes, that's why they look like that. They're doing it because they want Odo to be comfortable.
Oh, they probably mentioned that in that episode where they show up, but I don't remember. But that's interesting. Yeah, that's kind of that's not cool.
So they haven't discussed it yet, but Odo is not as good of a changeling.
It's like mocking a speech impediment,
right? Well,
right.
To claim that
I thought I'd make you feel more comfortable by doing a fake lisp.
Yeah.
So
like if we had done this podcast and Wes and I both did Irish accents.
Just to make me feel more welcome.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
I'm going to take
Bigosh and Bigara, the Jem'Hadar are some fierce lads, aren't they?
Yeah, you got it.
I'd have been like, oh, you what, mate? I've been out there all night. Sorry, we'll continue on. But anyway, I think that the character stuff works. We talked about the Federation. We talked about Odo and Garak. We talked about their torture scenes. the torture scene is very effective. It steps into the Odo knowing that Garak has this level that he can't go to, and he's sort of mocking Garak as it's going along. And then we can get into we were at 40 minutes, so why don't we just get into the sort of meta plot that's undertaking here, which is the big overall arcing plot, which is the first reappearance of the Dominion here, where the founders trick the Obsidian Order and Tal Shiar to invade and attack them. One of my problems with the Dice Cast is, while I love that this is how everything is kicked off, I feel like internally the episode is very not clear about what has happened here, where in terms of the outcome for the Cardassians and the Romulans, because there's a line, the Changeling has a line that says, after this day, the Cardassians and the Romulans are no longer a threat to us. There's only 20 ships in this fleet.
Right.
And
they're not even like officially Romulans and Cardassians.
Right. It's not the entire military going out there to sort of take care of things. And then, so after you get rid of that fact that it's only 20 ships, am I supposed to be led to believe that their entire intelligence agencies are on these ships, and so killing them wipes out the intelligence agency? It feels like it's trying to be dramatic in a way that is not necessary, and I would have just rather had either escalate the stakes of how many ships are in the fleet, or just sort of tie it down a little bit, so it's not this we've totally wiped out these two races and we're just coming for you guys next.
Well, I guess I was kind of reading it a little bit differently. Like, because my understanding was that, excuse me, the plan that Tane was a part of was not something that had been cleared by anybody in Cardassia or the Romulans.
Mm-hmm.
And executing his plan and failing was going to be more destructive to the Cardassians and the Romulans, because he has forced these two into an alliance in a way that they probably wouldn't have gone into otherwise, and they no longer have the element of surprise. Their special forces have been blown up, and they basically in failing in his mission, he has really put an imbalance between these two cultures that now have to probably work together.
Yes, they tied stones to each other, basically.
Yeah, and it has put them on the defense and put them on their heels, whereas the Jem'Hadar now have the upper hand and only really have to worry about the Federation. And I totally see what you're saying, where it's on a literal standpoint. Yeah, I don't. It's kind of silly to say that, because clearly they have more ships somewhere.
The Borg attack was literally 2 times as bad as this.
Right. Yeah.
For one species, for the Federation only. There wasn't anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think I was just reading it more like from a tactical standpoint, that they had struck a tactical victory that was pretty big.
Yes, as the title says, the die is cast, and they've rolled snake eyes basically. I think that what's interesting about the culture thing, Darren, if you wanted to talk about, is that it's a very unique Star Trek story, and the way that they're taking this, because the Dominion are unified through force and subjugation, and the Alpha Quadrant are very distinct cultural personalities that have very different perspectives on how to handle situations. This will become a much bigger issue in the 4th season with the Klingons. But what's funny is that you see this Cardassian and Romulan sort of alliance going off, and as Clay said, they've sort of tied each other down to failure at this point, and maybe it's just provoking the Dominion was the wrong thing, but the show and the series excels at this kind of using the cultural differences to be the politics and the drivers of different perspectives that you'd have in like a human environment, where you'd have the pacifists and you'd have the sort of war hawks and things like that. Do you think that we sort of touched on this in Improbable Cause, but do you see anything special about how the Romulans and the Cardassians are used at this point and in this episode of itself? Do you agree with Clay?
It's kind of interesting the way that Deep Space Nine deals with the Romulans over the course of its run, because it feels like Next Generation had Romulans as like their defining character trait was sneaky bastards. And it feels like Deep Space Nine is basically gone, okay, but the Cardassians are really good, sneaky bastards. So the Romulans, we don't really know what to do with. And it's kind of telling that after the die is cast, it almost feels like the writers were just using that as an excuse to write the Romulans out for about the next 3 years, until they came up with something interesting to do with them. With the Cardassians, I think you're entirely right, like Wes, that it makes no sense mathematically in terms of like this crippling the Cardassians and causing them to fall into chaos. And I think that that's very much a testament to the fact that this was, as we pointed out when we talked about Improbable Cause, a two-parter that was sort of written as not planned as a two-parter, but became this big epic thing. And I think that in fairness, they do go back and they sort of fill in the blanks a little bit in terms of like what chaos this actually caused on Cardassia, because it's not the loss of the fleet that is the big deal in terms of like the Cardassian Union, because obviously in Defiant, it's like, oh, it's a secret fleet. Which means that like losing a secret fleet isn't actually really that much of a loss, because you're left with what you had before you discovered that you had a secret fleet.
Right, it's like losing money that you found in the sofa. You never had it in the first place.
But it's that your friend found.
Or like losing the, spore drive technology.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, so it has that sort of aspect to it. But I think later episodes go back and they sort of flesh it out a little bit, and they suggest that basically what happened was, it wasn't the material loss of ships and lives that caused it. It was this basically caused the Obsidian Order to collapse and implode into itself, which is like 1/3 of the Cardassian government. You have like the Tutapa Council and the Central Command. And you have that basically, so you have one of the three prongs falling in, and then basically the idea is that will cause the other two to collapse, which sort of happens later on. You get through a bit of exposition and sort of again through like plot developments that sort of build off this in an interesting way.
Yep.
Again, one of the interesting aspects of Deep Space Nine is that because so much of the big shifts are improvised, what typically happens is, particularly in like late season two-parters, you have like these massive earth-shattering events which happen because the writers are writing a story, can't get it to work, and decide to throw in this massive universe-shattering twist. And then you have like the 4 or 5 episodes afterwards that were in development that just have to be written anyway without any reference to those big events. So it happens later on in the 5th season when something huge happens to the Alpha Quadrant powers. But it takes 4 or 5 episodes until anybody actually talks about it properly. And here you have it happen as well, where like immediately following this episode, which is like plunge the Cardassian Union into chaos, you have Sisko and Jake go on a lovable adventure in which they encounter a bunch of Cardassians who are like have fireworks with them. And it's like, what the hell happened? Are you guys not aware of what literally just happened?
I always find that really funny. Like for my obligatory Buffy the Vampire Slayer reference, on that show there would be whatever the big giant bad guy is. Like in the 2nd season where Angel comes back and he's like, I'm gonna kill you and all of your friends and you'll never know when I'm coming to get you. And then the next episode they're just fighting like a computer demon and just completely forget that he's even out there at all.
There's an element of that, I think, immediately after this as well that sort of happens. But I think it's very clever, and I think it's very interesting, because, I mean, one of the things about designing the Dominion for the writers of Deep Space Nine was that they, knew that, like, they have all the established sort of Alpha Quadrant characters, like the Klingons, the Romulans, the Cardassians. They're all, like, established sort of Star Trek archetypes at this point. And they knew that, like, Voyager was going to the Delta Quadrant, and it had been made very clear early on that Voyager would be dealing with the Borg, but they also had, like, the Kazon and the Vidians happening around the same time. So the Deep Space Nine writers had to come up with something for the Gamma Quadrant that was kind of different. So what they came up with was this idea of the Dominion as, and you're right, is this sort of like unified front. They're basically like a totalitarian state. They're a warped mirror of like the Alpha Quadrant powers, in that like the Jem'Hadar are very much mirrored with the Klingons repeatedly, to the point where in the Jem'Hadar, one of the Jem'Hadar says, boy, I really wish I'd met a Klingon. They seem like they'd be more my speed. And you have obviously the Vorta with their pointy ears, which are more like Romulans or sort of like Vulcans with their hinted telekinesis that's never really explored or explained or anything like that, but it's just sort of there. And you have the Founders, which are almost like the human characters in Star Trek, in that they're like the all-rounders with the great stats who can be absolutely anything they need to be at any given moment. And it's kind of interesting that you have this like counterpoint to Deep Space Nine's idea of like because the big recurring fascination of Deep Space Nine is like humanism and individualism, and that's what like distinguishes Deep Space Nine from the other Star Trek shows. Because the other Star Trek shows are very much like, well, what makes the Federation great is that we all work together and we work towards a common good. Whereas Deep Space Nine tends to be, what makes the Federation great is that it's a place where we can all be ourselves and we can all respect one another and have different viewpoints and meet other cultures.
And
so like the
all
Dominion
rally around the fact that we're racist towards Ferengi.
Yes,
very much so.
I think it's an interesting. It accurately sort of connects the dots to like a real world situation, which is that, well, it's great to have, non-nationalist, sort of individual based respect and like a sort of multicultural type thing. It kind of runs into the problem of pacifism, which is that if you truly believe in pacifism, you need to rely on other people to protect you from people who are going to harm you. And that's it's interesting that the Dominion is shown to be superior in this situation, just in terms of they are superior at invading and taking over places, because the strength of the Alpha Quadrant is the multicultural aspect, and that causes strife between the different groups. So they don't get along with each other. They don't trust each other. The Dominion takes advantage of that, and in this episode has worked to split them by not, because of this joint venture that left out the Federation and the Klingons. You've caused this schism between the relations there, and the Dominion and the Changelings in particular are very adept at working those cracks and separating people, and they sort of divide and conquer as an MO.
Yeah, which is really, really remarkable and very, very kind of clever. And it's interesting that Deep Space Nine sort of acknowledges, like, this is the thing, like, Deep Space Nine is a very humanist, very individual show, but it acknowledges, like, the material benefits of fascism in terms of the Dominion, and that, like, the Dominion are literally one mind. They are literally one entity. They are a force of one will, and that is very appealing in a certain set with a certain mindset and a certain culture. And it's, in some ways is better suited to warfare than democracy and liberal democracy. And as he pointed out, multiculturalism. And it's kind of interesting that Deep Space Nine does that, because it acknowledges in some ways the limitations of multiculturalism and liberalism, while still arguing that liberalism and multiculturalism are better just because they are, because they are inherently superior.
Because it fixes these characters, like it fixes Garak and Odo. It fixes them into recognizing the good that the Federation can provide.
Yeah, which is very good. And for all the cynicism of which Deep Space Nine is accused, and I think that, the fact that the Dominion are presented as strong in contrast to, like, the Federation and the Alpha Quadrant powers being, like, divided and squabbling and weak, is something that I think many critics of Deep Space Nine probably see as an example of the show being, like, dark and edgy and cynical. But I don't think it is. I think it's more being honest about acknowledging that, like, liberal democracy and multiculturalism aren't good because they will win any fight into which they're thrown through sheer force. They're better because they make us better people. And they're better in the long term. And I don't, like, again, this is something that plays through Deep Space Nine, and it pays off very dramatically, like, even as late as the final episode, where, like, what makes the Federation and the Alpha Quadrant powers great is not that they're stronger militarily or that they're more organized militarily. It's that they're just humanist. It's that they have this sort of sense of decency and integrity and care that runs through it. And I mean, it's very revealing that, like, at the end of the episode, Odo forgives Garak for torturing him. And at the end, Odo reaches out to Garak. Like, Odo's response to being tortured by Garak, being humiliated by Garak, being forced to acknowledge, like, a secret that it's heavily implied that even he is not comfortable admitting to himself, let alone to others, is not to, like, punish Garak for it. It's not to, like, shun him or lock him out of his life. It's to reach out to him and to say, look, I have come to understand that you feel lonely on this station in a way that I didn't feel before you tortured me. And I'm going to reach out to you as a friend because that's what friends do. That's what decent people do. And there's something very warm in that, even in, like, the darkness and the bleakness of the episode around it.
Yeah.
I like it when they use lasers.
And Garak's ending is the same thing, of realizing of what he's done to Odo by not including in the report what he's talked about. So it's a secret that will die between those two.
I love that last scene. I thought that last scene was awesome, and especially that they don't cut and you only see Odo in the shadowed reflection. I thought that was so cool. You don't see that kind of stuff on TV very often, and it was just, great stuff.
It tied into you.
It's David Livingston, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
It?
Yes, David Livingston.
One of the better Star Trek directors. He started as a producer, I think. But he's got a wonderful eye, and he's very good at framing stuff sort of atmospherically. He did the zombie episodes of Enterprise, for example, which is very well directed. And he did some really good Voyager episodes as well. But yeah, that's a great show.
And if it's into you, Clay, you had said that in a previous episode that you think the directors sometimes just make sure they get coverage of Garak or Andrew Robinson in every scene because they know they can cut back to him at any point. And the camera lingers on him.
Yeah, there's a great point where they kind of do that without cutting. Well, I guess they do it there without cutting too. But where I think maybe this is in the last episode. Anyway, there's a 2-shot where I think it's Odo and Tane are talking. And Garak is kind of in the background, and then he kind of like steps up so he's in between the two of them. And you just can't take your eyes off him, because even though he's just there listening, he's still acting his ass off, like shifting his eyes back and forth between each one of them as they're each saying their separate thing. And it's just like, he's a secret weapon on the show. Absolutely.
Yeah. I'll just talk a little bit more about the attack, I think, because it is very important in the Jem'Hadar sort of annihilation of this fleet and everything.
It's the first time we've really seen action on this scale on a Star Trek show, I think, if I remember correctly. I mean, even Wolf 359 took place entirely off screen. This seems to be, like, we talk about this episode in terms of being important, in terms of, like, meta plot, and in terms of, like, the Dominion, and in terms of the Romans and Cardassians. It's also important from, like, a technical standpoint, because it's the first time that the show has done, like, big, impressive, epic space battle action sequences with, like, Jem'Hadar ships pouring out, and, like, stuff exploding, and, like, Romulan ships getting blown up. And it feels like it sort of it shows what Deep Space Nine can do, which becomes very relevant at the start of the 4th season, and then later on into the 5th and 6th season, just technically speaking.
Yeah, they always tend to, like, shoot these larger battles very far away. Like I think do they show Wolf 359 in the first episode of Deep Space Nine?
Oh,
they do,
yes.
They
do.
And yeah, anytime that they show that, it always feels like a bunch of tiny ships just going psh, 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 against like the one larger ship. And this one is it felt like the first time that they really get up and close and personal. So when the Defiant comes in, you're like right next to it as it's like doing barrel rolls and shit and, blowing everything up. And that the sequence when they're coming in at the end and he's like, don't fire until, we're 500 meters away or something like that. That stuff was great. Yeah, that's a level of action that I feel like is not really on the show ever.
It's apparently that sequence you're talking about where the Defiant shoots the ships at 500 meters or whatever and then flies through the wreckage. Apparently it took 4 days of production to do that. I'm just thinking of, it's in the era of CG, you'd argue that they probably do this kind of stuff too often because of how easy it is to produce at this point. So it meant something for them to do it at that point.
Was that scene like them just showing their entire ball sack to Babylon 5?
But my personal favorite detail of this is, like, when people talk about, like, Star Trek being sort of intellectual science fiction and not being about, like, space battles and blowing stuff up, my favorite detail of this is that, like, if you go back to the original series, Ilan of Troyes is the only episode of Star Trek that features like a proper space battle in it, where the Enterprise and a Klingon ship fire one shot each at each other, and it's actually shown on screen. And the reason that it was the only episode where that happens is because it took something like 2 months of model work in order to get those scenes to work. Like, it was meant to be the second episode of the season. It ends up coming in like the second half of the season because post-production on like that one shot from one ship to another took so long. And it's kind of interesting how when technology moves along, and you're right that CGI makes it easier, because CGI is what makes like the later seasons of Deep Space Nine possible when they start doing this sort of thing on a more epic scale. And even this stuff here is probably like rendered a lot easier through like advances in technology and stuff like that. That's happened since The Next Generation went on the air.
Yeah. They should have just in the early seasons been like, so all of these ships have energy-based weapons, but we've chosen to illustrate those energy-based weapons in the form of a giant hammer. So anytime you see a ship exploding, it's just going to be a guy off screen smashing it with a hammer. That would save them a lot of money.
And it
would be great to see if they had done that. It would have been great to see that like evolve with the series to how do they depict the giant hammer weapon in this series? Like, what's the Deep Space Nine giant hammer weapon look like?
I love the idea of like spending millions and millions of dollars to like computer render that like really practical effect.
Yeah.
Like, It
Now
now,
we have-
glows and it's transparent.
We have 360-degree control of the giant hammer now that we do everything on the computer.
It's some guy in a VR headset, like using the hammer and as the rendering.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's. I don't know. Does anyone have anything else to talk about? This one, I don't know if we were. I don't feel like we were scattershot, but it's an episode that signals the changing of the guard. I think Clay would be a way to describe it.
Yeah.
People consider these two to be extremely important. We're going to return to the Dominion again. It doesn't take another 20 episodes to get to the Dominion. Mostly because we're at the end of the season, but it's a changing time. I think that the one point I wanted to make was that I think it's a clever bit of writing that when we met the changelings and they said that they were persecuted and that they what they do is they do in the name of defending themselves is why they conquer to create security. Their ethos is a clever bit of writing in that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that the bigger they get, the more likely they are to have people react to them like the Cardassians and the Romulans do, which in turn enables their point of view. It sort of is a defense of the way that they go about things, because they aren't wrong that they do have people trying constantly to attack them, but only because they have this sort of conquering ethos. And I think it's a good bit of writing. It's clever.
My question, and this goes out to you both and everyone else who listens to this show. Is this it? Is this the point where it all starts being consistently good, or is this another one of those things where it's like, this is what the show could be, but it's going to be another like 45 episodes until it gets to the point? But like, you know, that's what the last time earlier in the season we had that one really good one. I forget which one it was.
The Search, right?
Yeah, and which really got me into the show. Not that I'm not into the show now, but it really got me into it, seeing the potential. And the only thing that I heard was, yeah, you're right, that one was great. This season's going to be kind of rough. So is that what season 4 is looking at here? Is this like another, this one was great, and now it's like, we're going to have to watch the 4 episodes about Bashir getting stuck in like a time loop inside of his mother's womb or something?
Well, I have good news and I have bad news.
Oh, boy.
The bad news is that the 4th season has 3 separate Bashir episodes coming your way.
Nice.
The good news is that they're all actually really, really great. One of the things about Deep Space Nine, and again, this is like, the inheritance that it gets from the Next Generation as compared to Voyager.
This is sounding like it's going to be a long way of saying, yes, it doesn't get good, Clay.
No, it gets better. It gets better, and it becomes brilliant. And like the 4th season of Deep Space Nine is the moment at which everything clicks and it becomes fantastic. The thing with the 3rd season is that like Deep Space Nine learns. Deep Space Nine makes mistakes in order to learn from them, and you can actually see that a lot when you watch the 3rd season, the 4th season back to back. You can see that a lot of the stuff that goes horribly, spectacularly wrong in the 3rd season is like immediately remedied and improved upon in the 4th season. So, for example, they take the stuff that works. Like the 3rd season opens with what is effectively a second pilot, so the 4th season does that as well, and it's very clever. The 3rd season doesn't keep the Dominion round active long enough, so the 4th season learns from that mistake and instead sort of keeps its recurring threat like simmering throughout the season as a whole and repeatedly comes back to it. The 3rd season has difficulty spacing character-based episodes and doing generic Star Trek stuff that doesn't work. So the 4th season takes all those aspects and just throws out the generic Star Trek stuff that doesn't work and starts focusing on character a great deal. Like, a lot of what makes the 4th season great is rooted in the failures of the 3rd season. And there's a sense that, in the 3rd season, they're really, really trying repeatedly to make stuff work. Because this is the one where Michael Piller had sort of left to focus on Voyager and had then gone to work on Legends with UPN. And so he was no longer around to take charge. And Ira Behr was sort of in charge of the show for the first time and trying to figure out what was working. And it's the first Star Trek season that really tries long-form storytelling and serialization properly, over the course of the season, in that it introduced the Dominion, it adds details to the Dominion, and then it does this 2-parter, which furthers the plot with the Dominion. And it doesn't do it very well, because there are large stretches of the season where you just forget the Dominion exists. But then, because they learned from doing that, the 4th season is a lot better. It opens with a big event, and then it understands that it has to keep that event sort of fairly concurrent in people's mind. It has to have recurring threads and keep referencing back to it in a way that sort of builds momentum throughout. So yeah, the 4th season is one of the best seasons of television that I've ever seen. The 3rd season is not, but I think the reason the 4th season works so well is because it learns from the mistakes and improves upon the successes of the 3rd season as a whole. And that's why I think Deep Space Nine is so fantastic. And it's something that again, to come back to what Voyager didn't learn and Deep Space Nine did, Voyager instead settles for being mediocre throughout. It never tries anything ambitious, never tries anything particularly like crazy or out there. It never falls flat on its face in a way that Deep Space Nine does very, very rarely. But that's because it never swings for the fences. Whereas Deep Space Nine, the third season, is entirely swinging for the fences, and it is fairly scattershot, whether it hits or misses, but it learns enough from hitting that it manages to do it more consistently when it gets to the fourth season. And the final stretch from the fourth season through to the end of the series is probably the best consecutive run of seasons of the Star Trek show ever. Not to oversell it.
Yeah. It's
When does Worf show up?
season 4.
Ah, okay. That's all you had to say.
Thank you for the hard sell, but yeah, Worf just...
That's great. That's great. But does this car have locks on it?
Yeah, Worf shows up season 4. We have a Dominion-themed season finale for this one, season 3, and then we'll get back into it. I would agree with Darren. I would say that, well, my memory isn't as fresh. Season 4 onward, I remember season 4 as being very strong of a season of Star Trek. I think the first 10 episodes are pretty uniformly great.
It has 2 bum episodes, which is like a record low for a Star Trek series.
Yeah. So that's what you have to look forward to, Clay, I suppose, and everyone else who's listening. But it's the third.
And only one of those bad episodes has a sexy vampire in it.
Well.
Aw, only one?
So Clay only has one bad episode, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it. We'll kind of wrap it up there. We're going to take a break, play an audio clip. We'll come back, read some patient thoughts, and give our final thoughts, and then we will call it a day.
I just read the report that you wrote, and I wanted to thank you.
Me? For what?
For not mentioning my desire to return to my people.
I consider the entire conversation as something best forgotten.
As do I. Quark has expressed an interest in renting this space if you're not going to be using it.
Huh?
He mentioned something about an Argillian massage facility.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think Commander Sisko would approve of such an interesting facility on the promenade.
I tend to agree. But I do think he would approve of a tailor's shop.
Do you know what the sad part is, Odo? I'm a very good tailor.
All right, everybody. So if you support the show on patreon.com, you can leave your comments, and we'll read them on an upcoming podcast. I'll do that now. We can react to them. It is Christian Pouch says, Improbable Cause Dice Cast. I'll just pair them into one because he combined them. Now we're talking. Garak, Odo, the Obsidian Order, and the Dominion. Oh my. The exciting mystery starts with Garak blowing up his own shop and goes from there. One of the highlights of Season 3 and one that shows how much time spent building your characters and universe really pays off. We've been building up people like Tane and Garak, and we know that the Obsidian Order and the Dominion are capable, and we know what they're capable of. The ambush and the changeling reveal at the end are shocking and a good way to build and show how dangerous the Dominion is and let them win, which is something interesting that we hadn't just talked about, without actually having the good guys lose. Top 5 of the season easily. That's a good point we didn't mention, Darren. By allowing the Romulans and Cardassians to take the lead, you can have the show lose without being crippling to the Federation, which is a nice touch.
It is indeed, and I mean, the show's not exactly subtle in that. There's a moment where Sisko gets back and he's talking to Admiral Todman, and Todman's like, wow, this is like Wolf 359 all over again. And it's like, Sisko's like, yes, I was just thinking that, except it was probably worse. But it has that sort of like, yeah, you can cripple the Cardassians and the Romulans to build up the Dominion as a threat without having to do something with the Federation. So you can have the threat sort of continuing to build while still showing them to be like villains. Because like that's the issue with, say, the Borg. Like, the Borg are supposed to be these fantastic villains. But every time they go into battle against the Federation, they go into battle against our heroes. And as a result, they have to lose. Which means that every time the Borg appear, you diminish the threat because they can't win. Whereas this is very canny, and it's entirely correct there. It's very canny to have the Dominion go against the Cardassians and the Romulans because that allows the Dominion to have a victory. And it allows them to sort of have that, like, sorting algorithm of evil. And Clay sort of referenced Buffy as well. It sort of reminds me of how, like, if you wanted to show a villain was tough, you'd have them pick on Spike. Except this is much, much more successful because, like, the Cardassians are kind of a lot less pathetic than Spike at this point in the series, I think.
You know,
so
I was just thinking, This is kind of a non sequitur. But if we're coming up to a string of really good, if bad Deep Space Nine is now in our past, more or less.
Okay.
I would like to pitch a second season, like middle of the second season lull episode, where Odo gets knocked out, wakes up, has amnesia, finds himself stuck in the form of a woman.
Boy.
I feel like that's they didn't get enough goofy use out of Odo up to this point.
They didn't do the quantum leap version of
Yeah,
Odo.
like what there's never been an episode where he wakes up in like a weird form that he can't get out of and he forgets that he's himself. That seems like a layup of a bad episode.
Well, for
Is Renee Auberjonois still playing the role?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say it's Renee Auberjonois in drag as a woman. Yeah, that sounds like a terrible episode. Let's print that.
Oh, I'm about to say, I think you may get your wish in a couple of years, just not with that particular cast member.
Okay. I'll take what I can get.
I like that Clay's literally wished this episode into existence. So
Yeah.
listeners who are watching along for the first time, when you hit the episode, and you'll know that you hit the episode, it's entirely Clay's fault.
That episode is a tulpa of my creation.
I think it should be like the quantum leap thing where Odo thinks he looks like himself, so whenever he looks in the mirror, he sees Renee Auberjonois.
Ooh,
But if
yeah.
whenever
That's a good
anyone
way to
else,
do it,
it's someone
too.
else. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Could have done that.
Let's.
I'm just
Oh
saying.
my god, and would this be like a really bad... This would be around this time of the series, so you'd still have like Horndog Bashir as a supporting character, right?
Yes. Bashir starts hitting on Lady Odo. Come on. Now I know this. We're basically the Deep Space Nine writers' room at this point.
You'll also work in my favorite early season trope of Odo. Odo gets knocked unconscious quite a bit for some reason in the early seasons, and it doesn't seem like he's the character who should be able to be knocked unconscious, but he is. Let's see. Stephen Cobb says the Die is Cast, awesome episode. The interrogation scene with Garak and Odo was well done. Different camera angles, Garak's own dislike of the job, Odo's disturbing makeup. That said, I found that there were no consequences for Garak torturing Odo, and that stretched believability. Even more so that Odo invites him to breakfast. Some sort of personal Odo epilogue about not trusting Garak again, or some sign that things are not all okay between them would have been nice. Instead, it's treated like something they did when they had too many mimosas on a rainy night, and the next morning agreed not to talk about what they had done together. I disagree. I think that the writing supports why they are friendly with each other, because they recognize that they are the same. And that Odo knows that Garak was doing it just for his job, which is kind of how Odo sees himself doing his job. It's not personal. It's just about getting the job done.
It should also be noted that, it's been suggested in Necessary Evil before, and the show will come back to it again. Odo himself has done some very, very questionable things in his own past in pursuit of what he thought was justice. So I suspect that if any member of the cast was going to have moral flexibility towards Garak, with the possible exception of Bashir, who would probably just bring him chocolates and eat his isolinear rod if this happened, I feel like, Odo is probably the character who would be most understanding of Garak in that situation.
But at a certain point, Odo realizes that he's Odo, but he's still stuck in the form of a woman. But now he's conflicted because since he's been a woman, Kira has really opened up to this new woman on Deep Space Nine. So now he has to decide whether or not to tell her that he's actually Odo. You know what I'm saying?
Has he, through an awkward set of circumstances, begun a relationship with Jake Sisko and has to have really awkward interactions with Ben Sisko?
You read my mind.
I can't wait to meet, sort of Jake's new girlfriend.
No, I was going to say that. Yeah, you read my mind.
She's a bit more older and more refined than the Dabo girl. And Odo's like, whoa, this is going to be awkward.
I feel like we just figured out what we're going to do for the next time that we have to spitball a Star Trek episode on one of those AMA episodes or whatever.
I mean, you'll have to tie in the fact that, Sisko will accuse the Lady Odo and saying like, hey, only one person gets to lay erotically with my son, and that's me. And so we can close that kind of storyline up, because I think that's just left out there dangling. Joint Mango says...
And O'Brien is just disgusted by all of
it. He's the Everman.
O'Brien is very glad that this is not happening to him.
Yes. Joint Mango says, Scarecrowdo scene is very upsetting. Remember Lorca in the pain chamber? That was not upsetting. Star Trek Discovery writers did not watch the Dice Cast. Let's see here. Chad Wiley says the Dice Cast. Now this is how you develop an adversary. The episode's reference to Wolf 359 is pretty apt. Just like that episode established how unprepared the Federation was to deal with the Borg, this one establishes just how unprepared anybody is to deal with the Dominion. Although I doubt it was planned this way, the episode does effectively answer the question of why the Founders have been absent for most of the season. They've been plotting and executing the destruction of the Romulan and Cardassian intelligence agencies. The scene where the trap is sprung and everyone on the bridge just stands there in shock is pure gold. As if that weren't enough, we get more great interactions between Odo and Garak, culminating in that incredibly uncomfortable torture scene. The close-ups and the fantastic performances from Robinson and Auberjonois are brilliant and really convey the desperation and anguish that both characters are going through. I love that this episode shows a completely different, vulnerable side of Garak. Up to this point in the show, Garak is given the impression of having the upper hand in every situation, but here we get to see him realizing that he's not the man he used to be, and as much as he wants to be, he can't be that man again. The whole two-parter is top-notch, A+ all around.
So, like, calling it Tootsie, but with Odo, I think is giving it too much credit. But that's kind of what we're going for here.
That's
Todo. But yeah, back to the comment there. I actually think it's a very, very good point about the idea of like what the Dominion have been up to. I like the idea of Sisko being like, so we spent like the past half a season preparing for the Dominion to arrive. What have you guys been doing? And the female changeling's like, we do have a life outside of you, Ben.
I don't need to call you every time I leave work. There's a little bit of limits on what I need to do. Kyle Barrett says the Dice Cast, the action, political intrigue, and story ramifications are all great, but it's the character work of Garak and Odo that's the greatest success of the episode. Over the two-parter, the parallels between Odo and Garak have been fascinating to explore, coming to a head in the interrogation scene, probably the best scene of the show to date. Garak realizing he can't go back and be one with his people again, just as Odo admits that secretly that's all he wants to do. And then later, with Odo and Garak both rejecting to join their respective sides of the war, two outcasts saved by the people they can call friends before heading back to that beautiful Western-style community among the stars that they call home. It almost brings a tear to the eye. Probably the best episode of the show so far. And then lastly, Neil Brennan, who I mentioned before is the first-time viewer of this one of the only ones that I know that's never seen it before outside of Clay. The Dice Cast, it's all caps. It says, I am so here for this shit. Bring it the fuck on. That's it. Guys, thank you very much for leaving your comments. The Dice Cast.
Keep that comment in your pocket for when our episode of Deep Space Nine airs, because it's going to come back out.
I think that's it. Let's give our own personal ratings. Clay, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah. I would say, again, looking at them separately, I would probably give this one a 4. But as like a complete story, I think it's a 5, 100%. I mean, both of these two episodes together are really great. I think they each have the strength. Their strengths are more or less the same thing running through both of them. I mean, the Garak and Odo are just really great together. And yeah, they're exciting. They're good character work, and kind of to circle back to what you were talking about at the beginning about the epic stuff. They recognize that epic stories only work when the real stakes are smaller and more personal, and they do that really well here. Like the reason Transformers movies don't work is they literally destroy multiple cities en masse for 2 hours, but nobody gives a shit because the characters don't mean anything. The stuff they're going through doesn't matter. Whereas you've got something like Return of the Jedi, where you've got a massive invasion going on the Death Star and blah, 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 blah. But what's really working there is the small story being told inside the Emperor's, chambers and all that kind of stuff. And they recognize that, and they really, use it to their advantage, and they pay off, and they resolve the character stuff, and the large epic stuff is there to boost it up, and it's there to, keep the door open for stuff that comes later and is not forced into resolution. And I think it's just it's a really overall, it's a really I hesitate to say mature, but it feels like a mature way of handling this stuff, where it's they're letting things breathe in a way that they don't usually do, and I think it's great.
You'd probably still say Best of Both Worlds is your favorite two-parter, I would assume. And you have to consider both parts. Or do you think the second part brings it down?
Yeah, I honestly, I hardly even think about the second part of Best of Both Worlds ever.
Yeah.
Like for me, it's like when you say Best of Both Worlds, you're talking about the first one. I would say this is probably one of the best two-parters I've seen so far in either version of Star Trek.
Yeah,
because they don't really do them in the original series. But
yeah, it's no menagerie from TOS, but if they had just cut scenes from Emissary into this for half the run length, I think it might have competed with that episode. But
I think what makes it work too is like they neither one of the episodes is like front loaded. Like it's quality throughout. I mean, there are some things in each of them that maybe could be a little bit dialed in a little bit more. Like, you get that subplot in the second one, and some of the stuff in the first one, the peripheral stuff, although not as much.
Yeah, I feel Improbable Cause is a more lean script than this.
Yeah,
one
100%.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, but like, across it's the first one that I've watched, I feel like, where they are they're very satisfying as a two-parter. Like, I don't feel let down by the second part at all, which is so far rare.
Yes, unique in Star Trek history. Darren, what are you going to give this one?
I'd give it 4 joint fist punches out of 5. Because I do love that Garak homage where he ambushes the Romulan outside the cell with a patented, like, Kirk smackdown. Join your fists together and just whack them into a guy and it'll all work out for the best.
It's always either like a two-handed, like, double axe handle thing, or it's like an open palm strike.
Which I think Odo does to Garak. Is the open palm strike.
More persuasive language, yes. But yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what we said here. But I think, and to go back to what Clay was saying there about why it works so well as a two-parter, like, traditionally, two-parters, if you look at them as, like, single stories, the way that they're built around the cliffhanger as the pivot point. So it means that, like, episode 1 is building to the point of, like, maximum escalation. It's the shot of Picard on the Borg ship and Riker saying fire. Like, there's nothing you can do that will top that, because that's designed to get you coming back watching the next week. And the same thing with, say, Redemption, where it's Worf leaving the ship suddenly, or even like Descent, where it's like, oh my god, they've been captured by the Borg and Data's evil twin is leading them, that sort of stuff. Whereas what I think works really well about this two-parter and what makes it so unique is that, like, we when we talked about Improbable Cause, we talked about how, like, low-key the cliffhanger was, or the finale was. It's literally just like, hey, Garak shakes a dude's hand, and cut. But it works because they're 2 different episodes doing 2 different things, so it's Daya's cast doesn't have to build from the point of maximum escalation of Improbable Cause. It's free to be its own thing while still being, like, the same thing. It's a very delicate balance that the episode manages to sort of, like, work. And I think that, the Daya's cast is not as strong as Improbable Cause. You're right when you say it's a lot looser. In particular, that subplot involving the Defiant. Because, I mean, what would happen if the Jem'Hadar found them there while the cloak wasn't working? Can you do the audio equivalent of a push in on my face when I say we'll have to fight our way out?
Yes.
Or whatever that is. But yeah, on the other hand, it has, like, that wonderful character scene between Garak and Odo, which means that, like, when it gets to the big bombasty stuff blow up at the climax, which features, like, a wonderful score from Dennis McCarthy. Like, I think it's one of the first times that, like, the Star Trek franchise under Rick Berman has been allowed to have a distinctive sort of sound to it, where it has this sort of, like, operatic sort of space battle sort of stuff happening in the background. That doesn't feel impersonal. And Clay's entirely right that the reason why these epics work is because we're invested in the characters. And both Improbable Cause and the Daya's cast understand that both individually as episodes and also as, like, an overarching two-parter. So I really, really, really love this two-parter. It wouldn't be my favorite Star Trek two-parter. It probably wouldn't even be my favorite Deep Space Nine Star Trek two-parter, but it would be in the conversation.
Is your favorite one the one where they go back in time and meet Mark Twain?
Well, I didn't want, and he's played by Deep Throat from the X-Files as well. How'd you know that, Clay? Damn it! It's like you could read my mind.
So obvious sometimes.
I have really gigantic ears that go up the side of my head.
I think that for me, it's as the two-parter, it's a 5. I think the Dice Cast is the weaker of the 2 episodes, so I'm going to give it a 4. But it's a 4 that I really enjoy. The epicness is what makes it enjoyable for me. It's the ground-shaking changes that the series is undergoing. It actually brings back the Dominion. It's a perfect little Star Trek encapsulation, and I think you guys are right about just how they mix things up to make it not seem like it's a standard Star Trek two-parter. I really enjoy it. Anyway, that's about it. I give Improbable Cause a 5 and this one a 4. Guys, thank you very much for supporting the show. Thank you for listening. If you're on patreon.com/the Pensky File, you can support the show there. You get extra podcasts. We talked about Watchmen the other day. We talked about RoboCops are all up there. We've talked about our AMA things. You guys can go there, support
Don't
the
forget,
show.
I guess that's not a Patreon. I was going to say, shit. What's the name of the friggin' Denzel Washington movie we just watched?
The Equalizer.
Oh, no,
Nope.
we watched a Heart Condition.
Pelican Brief? Okay.
Hard Condition. There we go. Yeah.
It's his,
Hard Condition?
it's his-
What's Hard
it's
Condition?
his lowest
Wow.
rated film.
You should listen to the podcast and find out.
We did that.
Sounds amazing.
And as Clay brings up, we have the Real Ripe and Real Rotten show. And the next one, it looks like it's going to be Edgar Wright. Clay is the next person that the patrons have voted that we talk about. So it's going to be Scott versus the World. What is that?
Ugh. Scott Pilgrim.
Scott
versus the
Pilgrim.
World.
Scott Pilgrim. And what's his highest one? His highest one is,
Probably.
Wait, Scott Pilgrim is his lowest ranked one?
yes, Edgar Wright. Hold on.
that makes sense. I'm
Edgar,
going to say it's got to be like Hot Fuzz.
Hot Fuzz.
Baby Driver.
What?
Wow.
Baby Driver's is
oh.
high. Yeah.
This is the first one where I'm going to actively be negative because I don't like either of those movies.
It'll be
you know,
The
it's
Rotten and
what?
Rotten show.
I'm really disappointed because being able to do a non-Simon Pegg Edgar Wright movie and a Simon Pegg Edgar Wright movie would have really helped me solidify my case that I think Simon Pegg is the secret weapon in their relationship, because I don't think that he writes very good movies without Simon Pegg.
Interesting.
So I won't be able to compare and contrast there.
So unless you guys go crazy with the voting, it looks like that. The next closest is Dennis Villeneuve. He's in second place, but he's a couple votes behind. So we'll see.
That's interesting.
Let's see. That's about it, guys. Thank you very much. You can go to all the Facebook, social media, Twitter, blah, blah, blah. Discord channel's a good place to go. Patreon.com, all that stuff. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for supporting the show. Clay, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Darren, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much.
And guys, that's about it. We'll be back with Explorers, which is the next episode after this. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time.